Hello everybody. So today I'm going to be presenting the case study from International Economics Theory and Policy book about the North-South trade and income inequality in the United States. And here are some keywords that I have found that represent this topic: recession, wealth, development, distribution, education, labor markets, protection, skills, trade, unemployment, and wages, among others. So here's a little preview of the key points that I'm going to be talking about. First, I'm going to give a bit of background about the trade in the United States so that we can understand the following points. Then a brief introduction about the North-South trade, and then another introduction about income inequality so that we can get to the next point, which is the case study. Then we will be analyzing some possible causes of wage inequality and then get to a conclusion. And finally, I'm going to give the key points of this whole case study. So for a little bit of background, trade has played an essential role in economic development for centuries, as we all know, and it has been a significant force for alleviating poverty, boosting economic growth, creating jobs, reducing prices, increasing the variety of goods for consumers, and helping countries acquire new technologies. However, trade between the most developed and less developed countries, which is known as North-South trade, which I will explain later, and wage inequality has been a subject of great controversy in the past decades, and in this case we are going to be focusing on the United States. So since 1970, American incomes have been less equal, let's say. So living standards of the poor have fallen while those of the affluent Americans have improved, and the trend towards inequality has not been confined to the United States. Nations through the industrialized world have seen income disparities rise since the 1970s, as I said before. Advanced economies such as the United States, for example, are plentiful in highly skilled labor, while low-skilled labor is rare. That is because since the 70s, international trade has had the potential to negatively affect low-skilled labor workers in the United States, creating an important wage gap. Similarly, income inequality has been affected by the increased trade, among other reasons which I will get into in the following slides. So to better understand this, let's make an introduction to North-South trade and income inequality. So the North-South trade. So first of all, what do we mean by North-South trade? This refers to a model in developmental economics that explains the growth of the South economy, meaning developing countries, that interacts through trade with the North or developed industrialized countries. So if this is the first time you hear about this concept, like me, of a gap between the North and the South economies in terms of development and wealth, it was introduced in 1980 by Willard Brandt as a visual depiction called the Brandt line. So the Brandt line shows how the world was geographically split into relatively richer and poorer nations, and the study to draw the line was based on GDP per capita. Now, as for the topic of income inequality, income inequality in the United States has become a major concern since the 70s. And most economists would agree that the origins of income disparities are caused by the growth of trade between countries, although this is a topic of controversy, which I will get into later. And trade relations between advanced industrial nations such as the US and less developed economies have altered the shape of the income distribution. At the same time, technological innovation is also considered a major driving force in the wage structure, which benefits highly skilled workers, for example in the use of computers, artificial intelligence, and so on. Therefore, many different factors, including trade and new technologies, have contributed to the income inequality in the United States, among other nations. And even though the causes of inequality are difficult to identify, it is useful to consider each major factor. In this case, the argument that trade is to blame for U.S. wage inequality rests on the assumption that trade hurts the United States workers with skills similar to those of workers in developing countries, so meaning low-skilled workers. The intuition behind this view is straightforward. Poorly paid unskilled workers overseas take away job opportunities through trade and drive down the wages of unskilled American workers. Okay, so now let's get into the actual case study of the book. So for the past 4 decades, the United States has been experiencing a wage crisis. From the end of World War II through the 1970s, in the US economy, there was a rapid wage growth that was widely shared by other nations. However, since the end of the 70s, 1979, average wage growth has decelerated sharply, and the same pattern of slow and unequal growth continues in the ongoing recovery from the Great Recession, which was one of the worst economic crises in the United States, which lasted from 2007 until 2009. And as an example, in 1970, a male worker in the 19th percentile of the total wage distribution, which accounts for 100%, of course, earned 3.2 times the wage of a male worker at the bottom 10th percentile of the range. However, by 2016, a worker in the 19th percentile made more than 5.5 times as much as a person in the lower 10th percentile of the wage distribution. As a result, there is a salary disparity of nearly double. Also, wage inequalities between male and female workers have risen at a similar rate during the same time span. So, even though I have mentioned some, which are the actual causes of this wage inequality? The case study suggests several reasons and concludes with a different idea, so let's take a look. So the first reason given by this book is the rise in premium education. So this inequality has been related to the rise in investment of the government in education, mainly in the 80s, which rose to over 80%. Such difference in wages reflects the problem of comparability of educational attainments that still exist in the United States and, of course, in other nations. So, for example, at that time, in the 80s, workers with a college degree earned about 40% more than workers with a high school education degree. So these wage disparities since then have stayed quite flat, except in relation to the level of studies among college graduates, which is still growing. The second reason proposed is the growth of world trade between nations or international trade. So this inequality has also been attributed to the growth of global trade, especially to the growing exports of manufactured goods from newly industrialized economies like China or Mexico. So to understand this, let's take a look at a bit of history. So until the decade of the 70s, the traditional model of trade between North and South nations consisted of the exchange of raw materials and agricultural goods such as oil, coffee, and so on from the South or less developed nations for manufacturers from the North. So this model has dramatically changed since the 70s, with the South focusing on selling manufactured goods to high-wage nations like the US. The NIES, which are the newly industrialized economies, provided a big market for exports from high-wage nations. The new economic markets differed greatly in the kinds of goods exported. So NIES exports to advanced nations consisted mainly on low-tech goods such as shoes, clothes, and so on, whereas production is based on unskilled labor. And in contrast, advanced countries exported high-tech goods such as chemicals, aircraft, technologies, and so on. So besides these two reasons or arguments, many observers concluded that what was happening was move toward factor price equalization, and the factor proportions model actually predicted this economical phenomenon. So as a brief explanation, as I've mentioned before, in developed nations, in this case, the United States, trade between advanced countries, again, the United States with abundant capital and skill, and newly industrialized economies with abundant and skilled labor, was raising highly skilled employees' wages while lowering the salaries of less skilled workers, creating such a big wage gap. So these reasons and assumptions leads to some other ideas. So if one believes that trading with low-wage countries is a major cause of wage gap in the US, this argument is convincing, and it leads to the conclusion that economists' traditional support for free trade is problematic. So, for example, under this assumption, if advanced countries like the US want to stay middle class, they should limit free trade with these less developed countries. However, empirical researchers have found that international trade is the most important element in trade growth, and that the cause of this inequality and wage gap lies elsewhere. So there are three elements that contribute to, or three reasons that contribute to this skepticism. First, the factor proportions model, which says that international trade has affected wage inequality via the rise of prices of goods. So a rise in skill-intensive products such as technology compared to those that need unskilled workers, for example, clothes or shoes. However, there is no clear evidence of this changing in relative prices. Another factor to take into account is that this model also says that if wages of skilled workers are rising and those of unskilled workers worsening in developed countries like the US, the contrary must be happening in developing countries. In Mexico, for example, studies have proved that this is true. So since the 80s, Mexico opened itself to global trade and became a major exporter of manufactured goods. This led to a rise of wages in skilled workers and a parallel inequality in wages. The same has happened in China in more recent years since they joined the World Trade Organization. And the last factor is that argument is that although trade between developed countries and newly industrialized economies has grown, the skilled labor exports embodied in skilled intensive products and the skilled labor imports embodied in labor intensive imports only account for a small percentage of the total spending in advanced nations. So this leads us to the conclusion that global trade flows don't have a huge impact on the income distribution, and thus on wage gaps or disparities. So then let's go back to the main question of this whole case study as a conclusion. So what is then responsible for the growing gap between skilled and unskilled workers in the US? So whether past trends in North-South trade and their effects on skilled and unskilled workers continue, cease, or change depends on the future course of barriers to trade and the relative supply of skilled and unskilled labor in the North and South nations. Barriers to trade will probably continue to decline, bringing an ever-widening range of goods and services within the scope of the skill-based North-South division of labor. Also, more exports of labor-intensive manufactures from NEAs will lower prices and widen wage gaps in countries like the US. Rising skill supplies in middle-income countries will then intensify the competition in the least skill-intensive traded sectors in the north and further widen skill differentials there. Thus, trade has probably been more a factor of trade growth rather than the definite villain of this inequality. Rather, new technologies used in production that need highly skilled people to manage computers and other high-tech goods may have been the main problem here. This is called skill-biased technological change, which is a shift in the production technology that favors skilled workers, so for example, more education, more able, more experienced, over unskilled labor by increasing its relative productivity and therefore its relative demand. And now let's go back to the main ideas of this presentation. So first of all, we talked about how until the 70s the traditional trade model was based on the exports from poor countries of raw materials such as coffee and so on to advanced nations, which dramatically changed since the 70s with the poor nations focusing on selling manufactured goods to high-wage nations like the US, and this caused this huge wage gap that we have been talking about. After the 70s, the US economy has been characterized by low-paid jobs and rising wages disparities, as I was saying, despite the increased productivity. Also, in developing countries, which we said are called the South, unskilled workers have benefited from this trade, but in developed countries, which we said were called the North, the gains have been concentrated on those with skills, while unskilled workers have suffered falling wages and rising unemployment thus. So the final conclusion is that the main reason for wage inequality in the US is industrial technology that require highly qualified workers, which, as I said, is called skill-biased technological change. And that is all for my presentation. Here are some resources from which I obtained some of the arguments that I talked about in the whole presentation, but most of them were taken from the International Economics Theory and Policy book. And I hope everything is clear. To me, it was a hard topic to talk about because I didn't know much about international trade or the history behind it. So if you have any questions, please let me know. You can write me on the email or whatever. And here are some resources if you want to know more in depth about this topic. So thank you so much.